Very much.
I thank the gentleman. Let me just, again, thank our witnesses for being here and for my colleagues for being here this afternoon to discuss the First Amendment, one of the great freedoms the American people enjoy. And we're doing so at a time where, in the not-too-distant past, we have seen the federal government, specifically the IRS, target people for exercising their First Amendment free speech political rights. We do so at a time where over the past academic year, there have been several troubling incidents at colleges across the country, and today we hear firsthand from our witnesses who are at the forefront of the debate over free speech on America's campuses. There's been a trend of intolerance against those voicing unpopular ideas or speech deemed disagreeable or offensive by some students and faculty at colleges and universities. This is occurring across the ideological spectrum and even at law schools, where students should be taught to engage in a civil way with each other's viewpoints. This past March at Lewis and Clark Law School and at the City University of New York Law School, protests disrupted speakers who were invited to speak. At Lewis and Clark, a member of the school administration was present, reportedly the dean for diversity, but they stood by and did nothing, allowing a heckler's veto to silence an invited speaker, instead of encourage students to debate ideas that they disagreed with. In another incident, administrators at a community college forced an 8-year Navy veteran to stop distributing, now get this, pocket-sized U.S. constitutions. Professor Raskin, we wouldn't want students reading the Constitution, would we? Because he hadn't received a permit to distribute a pre-approved material. So the very document that allows us to enjoy this great nation wasn't deemed pre-approved material. This individual took an oath to defend this document and the ideals it embodies, but he wasn't allowed to hand out free copies of the United States Constitution. Because this student stood up for the most basic rights, the school, thankfully, changed their unconstitutional policy. At our first hearing on this subject, we heard from civil rights experts, administrators, and speakers who had been shouted down, threatened, disinvited because of their beliefs. We even heard from a comedian, Mr. Krishnamurthy. I think you made a little joke about the length of the letters in your name. Today, our panel consists of witnesses who were not only shouted down, but physically assaulted in the case of Dr. Stanger, and ousted from their teaching job in the case of Dr. Weinstein. Let's be clear. College is a place for young minds to be intellectually stimulated and challenged with new ideas and ways of thinking. Unfortunately, at many institutions, students and faculty are forced into self-censorship out of fear of triggering, violating a safe space, committing a microaggression, or being targeted by a bias response team. At one university, when reporting bias, and I quote, "The most important indication of bias is your own feelings." Real objective standard there, Mr. Raskin, right? To borrow a phrase from facts don't care about your feelings, and as Justice Brandeis told us, the answer to bad speech is more speech. Restricting speech that does not conform to popular opinion imperils the politically weakest among us from speaking at all, which is exactly what the First Amendment is designed to prevent. When students go back to school in the fall, are these institutions going to be more open to civil debate? We certainly hope so, and that is the focus of our hearing today. And so again, thank you to our witnesses for appearing with us today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony in just a few minutes. But first we have the gentleman, the right fine gentleman with the long name, who is the ranking member who gets his opening statement, and then we'll get right to our witnesses.
I welcome comedic speech at this hearing, and I hope there will be some to lighten things up. I should just tell you, in that hearing, I introduced myself as Raja Krishnamurthy, and someone said, Roger Christian Murphy. Very nice to meet you. I didn't know the Irish made it to India. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, ranking members, for allowing me just a couple minutes of time to address this very important topic. Our First Amendment protections are among our most cherished rights, and I think everybody in this room knows that. Free speech is a cornerstone of the nation's commitment to ensuring that we are able to have a robust and wide-open discussion. The Supreme Court has rightly held that practically any peaceably expressed idea cannot be suppressed by law, no matter how unpopular, repugnant, crude, or ill-informed it may be. While certain restrictions on the time, place, and manner of speech can exist, Any law that seeks to limit the substance of speech should be approached with great caution. Restrictions may exist on how, when, and where people say things, but the government fundamentally should not restrict what people say. However, free speech does not mean the right to be free from criticism. As I have a right to state my view, you have a right to disagree vocally, passionately, and peaceably, and humorously. There is a clear and present danger facing colleges and universities across the nation making peaceful disagreement difficult, namely an increase in white supremacist hate groups on campuses and the targeting and harassment of students because of their religion, race, and sexual identity. This is not about culture wars or liberal versus conservative. This is about our values as a society, making our children safe to engage in civil discourse, to use their First Amendment rights free from coercion. Today, white supremacist groups and other hate groups are a significant challenge for the exercise of First Amendment rights on college campuses. According to the Anti-Defamation League, white supremacists are engaged in an unprecedented set of outreach efforts on American college campuses. They are pursuing a deliberate strategy of recruiting college students. They are also increasing the incidence of hate speech on campuses, targeting and threatening students for their race, religion, and sexual identity. From the fall of 2016 to the fall of 2017, the ADL reported that there was a 258% increase in white supremacist propaganda efforts, such as the dissemination of racist flyers and stickers on college campuses. Along with this rise came an increased number of incidents of anti-Semitic, racist, and other hateful expressions that target and harass students on college campuses. The Southern Poverty Law Center reported that in the first 10 days after the 2016 presidential election, there were 140 incidents of hate bias attacks on university campuses. Coinciding with these unprecedented increases in hateful expression, a significant decrease in free speech suppression on college campuses is also happening. The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education reports that in 2017 there were just 35 disinvitation attempts, of which 19 were successful. This number is down from 43 in 2016. This organization also reported that the number of universities having official quote-unquote speech codes has been dropping each year and is currently at an all-time low. As we examine the issue of free speech today on college campuses, let's keep the focus on addressing the real source of danger to the expression of freedom of speech, namely an alarming increase in white supremacist and hate group activity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I would ask unanimous consent that Ms. Stefanik, Ms. Handel, Mr. Estes, Mr. Bratt, and Mr. Perry be able to participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. We now turn to our distinguished witnesses. Mr. Lane-Hoffman, Mr. Tyson Lane-Hoffman is Senior Counsel and Director for Center for Academic Freedom at the Alliance Defense Fund. Mr. Lane-Hoffman, we appreciate you being here. Dr. Brett Weinstein, Professor in Exile, and I believe that's an actual title you have now. Is that right, Mr.? Yeah. Professor in Exile, Evergreen State College from Washington is with us. We appreciate you being here. Dr. Allison Stanger, Professor of International Politics and Economics at Middlebury College in Vermont is with us. And Dr. Sean Harper, Professor of Education and Business at the University of Southern California. And of course, Dr. Robert George McCormick, Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, of course, in New Jersey, is with us. Welcome to all. Pursuant to committee rules, I ask that you all stand. We swear everyone in here, so if you please stand, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that everyone, each witness answered in the affirmative. Mr. Lane-Hoffman, we're going to go right down the list. Actually, we're going to start with Dr. Stanger. Then we're going to go right down the list. So we'll start with Dr. Stanger first, and then move right down there. So, Ms. Stanger, you're recognized.
Well, thank you very much. You've invited me to testify about my own personal experiences with free speech issues on college campuses and what I have learned from them. It's an honor and privilege to share some thoughts with you here today, and I look forward to answering your questions. Many see a leftward ideological tilt among university professors and programs as compared with the general population. While it is undeniably true that most American professors do not identify as conservative, I would argue that the academy is not tilting leftward. Rather, it is defining college community in opposition to the life of the mind. This is no trivial reorientation. Nothing less than free inquiry and the civil discourse upon which American constitutional democracy depends is at stake. I think this is a situation that can be righted, and it should be up to universities to do that, but we can talk about that. So what can be done? I think calls for viewpoint diversity will not entirely address the problem because they simply further politicize a realm that should make every effort to transcend politics and give every scholarly argument its proper due, regardless of its origins and regardless of what majority opinion might be. Balancing left and right, that is, a political agenda, is of lesser importance than allowing reason, logic, and above all, empathy to reign supreme. The university must therefore stand against groupthink and campus illiberalism. It must take the lead in educating our students and the public on the dangerous consequences of believing you can build a better world through the dehumanization of other human beings. The voices of the marginalized must be amplified and heard, while remembering always that extremism in all its permutations is ultimately the denial of empathy's importance for human flourishing. Perhaps most importantly, there is also a role for every American citizen to play, especially distinguished members of Congress. Each and every one of us can model the behavior we would like to see from others. Our political discourse in this country would improve immeasurably if all of us would simply renounce lies and ad hominem attacks masquerading as arguments, and instead call them out for what they actually are: threats to the civil discourse on which free inquiry, democracy, and the rule of law depend. Much is at stake in defending freedom of expression, because democracy cannot function when loyalty trumps truth. In a 1974 interview, Hannah Arendt explained, "If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please." While breaking with our own tribe for the sake of the truth may be uncomfortable, we as Americans are indisputably free to do it. We owe it to ourselves and to our children who are watching us to avoid taking the path of least resistance and instead do what is right, both to defend truth and to defend the Republic. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Lane-Hoffman, you're recognized.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Tyson Lane-Hoffman, and I'm Senior Counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom and the Director of the Center for Academic Freedom, which is dedicated to protecting freedom of speech and association for students and faculty at public universities so that everyone can freely participate in the marketplace of ideas without fear of government censorship. Over the last 12 years, ADF has secured almost 400 victories for free speech on America's college campuses. While these victories show that the law is on the side of free speech, the fact that there are this many infringements taking place raises grave concern. In the United States, the only permit a student should need to speak freely on public university campus is the First Amendment. But unfortunately, many taxpayer-funded public universities enforce policies that suppress and stifle the marketplace of ideas that campuses were intended to be. And they create a college culture that fears rather than respects differences of opinion. Ironically, colleges are some of the most diverse places in the entire country, spending millions of dollars every year on all kinds of diversity initiatives. Yet public universities are some of the most ideologically intolerant places in the entire country. Why is that? There exists a lack of intellectual diversity, respect for a diversity of thought. Uniformity of thought breeds intolerance, especially when enforced by government mandate. Unfortunately, most of today's colleges have chosen to regulate rather than to respect freedom and authentic diversity. They do so by enacting an array of policies that infringe upon students' First Amendment rights. I will briefly discuss three of the most prevalent. The first category is a speech zone policy. A speech zone is a policy that prohibits students from speaking or distributing literature anywhere in the open outdoor areas of campus except for a very small speech zone. For example, we recently represented Michelle Gregory, a student at Kellogg Community College in Michigan. Michelle was in the process of forming a Young Americans for Liberty student group. Michelle and three other YOW supporters were on a large open walkway on campus handing out pocket-sized copies of the U.S. Constitution. They were not blocking access to buildings or pedestrian traffic and were not interfering with any activities. Yet college administrators and campus security arrested, jailed, and charged them with criminal trespass simply for speaking outside the speech zones. Thankfully, after ADF filed a lawsuit, the charges were dropped and the school eventually changed its policy. But students literally spent the evening in jail for asking their fellow students if they'd like to learn more about freedom and the U.S. Constitution. The second category of unconstitutional policies is speech codes. A speech code is a policy or regulation that prohibits or punishes certain types of speech that colleges view as demeaning, uncivil, derogatory, or discriminatory. For example, ADF represents Chike Uzabunam, a student at Georgia Gwinnett College. Chike was in an outdoor area of campus talking with other students about his faith. School officials ordered him to leave because they said he had violated the college's speech code, which forbids any expression that, quote, disturbs the peace and or comfort of persons. After ADF filed a lawsuit, the school modified this portion of its policy, but this case is still ongoing. The third category of policies involve how schools allocate student activity fees. A student activity fee is a mandatory fee that most colleges charge in addition to tuition to fund the expressive activities of student organizations. Unfortunately, many universities' student activity fee policies are allocated in an unconstitutional, viewpoint discriminatory manner. For example, last month, we filed a lawsuit against Kennesaw State University on behalf of Young Americans for Freedom. The college gives university officials sole discretion to rank student organizations subjectively into one of four classifications that function as a sort of caste system for preferential treatment, including which areas of campus that they can use and the amount of funding for activities. These are just a few examples demonstrating that today's colleges are failing to educate their students about rights afforded by the First Amendment and about their duties as citizens of this great country. Our First Amendment demands better. Our colleges can do better. Our students deserve better. In an essay on the purpose of education, Dr. Martin Luther King said, "To save man from the morass of propaganda, in my opinion, is one of the chief aims of education. Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction." Dr. King closed with this warning: if we are not careful, our colleges will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists consumed with immoral acts. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers. I commend the members of this committee for recognizing the importance of protecting college students' First Amendment rights on campus, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lane-Hoffman, for that. I notice we have some young people with, lots of young people in the audience. Some have T-shirts on. We want to welcome the students who are here supporting First Amendment rights. And I also notice we have a nice young lady who happens to be the wife of our colleague, Mr. Meadows, who's in the audience, along with their son, Blake. So welcome to Ms. Meadows and Blake as well. And we now go to Dr. Weinstein, professor in exile. We're waiting for what that all means. Doctor, you got 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to address you. Tomorrow is the one-year anniversary of the day 50 Evergreen students that I had never met, disrupted my class, accusing me of racism and demanding my resignation. I tried to reason with them. I felt no fear because I knew that whatever my failings might be, bigotry was not among them. At that moment, I felt sure I could reach them. I also felt a moral obligation to try. That racism squanders human potential and erodes human dignity offends me. I am also well versed in the evolutionary logic that makes racism durable. I should have had no trouble establishing common ground. Their response surprised me. It would take months for me to fully understand what had happened. The protesters had no apparent interest in the very dialogue they seemed to invite. I was even more surprised by the protesters' fervor in shouting down my actual students, some of whom had known me for years. The cruelty and derision reserved for students of color who spoke in my defense was particularly troubling. If not discussion, what did they want? I was one of Evergreen's most popular professors. I had Evergreen's version of tenure. Did they really think they could force my resignation based on a meritless accusation? They did think that, and they were right. What I had not counted on was their alliance with Evergreen's new president. Though the protesters openly humiliated him, the president of the college partnered with the mob in private, handing them concession after concession. We know this because the rioters filmed everything and proudly uploaded it. In one particularly telling video, the president calmly discusses with the leaders of the protest a demand to target STEM faculty based on the empty assertion that scientists are particularly prone to bias. In that same video, the president speaks of his plan for those who resist the new order. Bring them in, train them, and if it doesn't take, sanction them. He invites his partners to hold him to it. On the second day of unrest, the police chief called me. Rioters were stopping traffic and searching for someone car to car. The chief believed that they were searching for me. She was worried for my safety and helpless to protect me, as the president had ordered her force to stand down. What would have transpired if the rioters had found me? I still don't know, and I strongly suspect they don't either. The protest at my class did not emerge out of the blue in May of 2017. 1 year earlier, I stood up and spoke in opposition to a dangerous proposal, one that threatened to establish a racial hierarchy amongst faculty. To those who have not faced something similar, this likely sounds hyperbolic. But one can now advance such policies and almost certainly succeed in passing them if they are properly draped in weaponized terminology. Equity, for example, has taken on special properties. If a person opposes an equity proposal, those advancing the proposal are secure in asserting that the person is motivated by opposition to racial equity itself. In other words, they are racist. My opposition to that first equity proposal was voiced to my colleagues with no students present. Demands for my resignation 1 year later, in May of 2017, were not the result of organic student confusion. They were payback for violating a de facto code of faculty conduct in which one's right to speak is now dictated by adherence to an ascendant orthodoxy in which one's race, gender, and sexual orientation are paramount. The students were on a mission. They were unwitting tools of a witting movement. This committee should take my tale as cautionary. Is there a free speech crisis on college campuses? One can certainly make that argument, but that portrayal is at least as misleading as it is informative. What is occurring on college campuses is about power and control. Speech is impeded as a last resort, used when people or groups fail to self-censor in response to a threat of crippling stigma and the destruction of their capacity to earn. These tools are being used to unhook the values that bind us together as a nation: equal protection under the law, the presumption of innocence, a free marketplace of ideas, the concept that people should be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Yes, even that core tenet of the civil rights movement is being dismantled. Am I alleging a conspiracy? No. What I have seen functions much more like a cult, in which the purpose is only understood by the leaders, and the rest have been seduced into a carefully architected fiction. Most of the people involved in this movement earnestly believe that they are acting nobly to end oppression. Only the leaders understand that the true goal is to turn the tables of oppression. Something is seriously and dangerously amiss. At this moment in history, the center does not hold. Partisan polarization and political corruption have rendered government ineffective, predatory, and often cruelly indifferent to the suffering of American citizens. Tribalism is the natural result. Evergreen's public meltdown placed me in the eye of the storm and cast me into the spotlight. As a member of the intellectual dark web, I find myself at the vanguard of an emerging, non-ideological, non-partisan movement. Along with the Heterodox Academy and the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, we are fighting to restore civility and respect for competing perspectives. The electorate is starved for honest debate and for the good governance that follows from it. My advice to this body is to put the nation and its core values ahead of partisanship and join us in the center to end this cultish power grab and return us to a forward path as a nation. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Harper.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members, thank you for inviting me to contribute to this important conversation. In my prior role as a tenured professor at the University of Pennsylvania, I founded an interdisciplinary research center focused on race and education, workplace settings, and our larger society. I relocated that center with me to the University of Southern California last summer. I've spoken about the center's studies and my independent research at hundreds of colleges and universities across the United States. Surely, not every person on campuses at which I've spoken found my ideas and research findings agreeable. Notwithstanding, I've never had a speaking invitation withdrawn or had any group publicly protest the speech I delivered. It is important to acknowledge, however, that university administrators absolutely reserve the right to rescind speaking invitations they extend to me or anyone else. As a matter of fact, they typically make this clear in contractual agreements. These contracts are between institutions and their invited guests. I see no need for congressional intervention. For at least 3 reasons, tuition-paying college students have the right to protest people who bring hateful and poisonous messages to their communities. First, it is their campus. They pay to be there. Students have to learn and, in many cases, live there long after controversial speakers have come and gone. Second, student activity fee money is often used to fund expensive speakers, including those whom conservative student groups invite. Most people feel they have a say in something their money helps to finance. College students who pay tuition and fees are entitled to oppose spending thousands of their dollars on inflammatory, divisive guest speakers. Third, and most importantly, college students have the constitutional right to protest. Their freedom of speech is just as valuable as the First Amendment rights of controversial speakers and people who support them. My PhD is in higher education. This has been my primary academic field of study for 2 decades. Having been elected by my peers to serve as national president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education, I feel a serious sense of responsibility to help preserve colleges and universities as marketplaces for contested ideas and sites of serious intellectual debate. I wholeheartedly agree that more speech, not less, advances the democratic purposes of American higher education. Sending millions of college-educated citizens into the workforce with little experience talking with people who disagree with them politically is a significant failure of our nation's post-secondary institutions. Many campus conflicts pertaining to speech are inescapably racialized. Race is almost always at the center. Yet, in conversations about free speech, rarely is race and racism ever named. My research shows that we send far too many college graduates into the workforce without a proper course of study on race, racism, and racial inequity. Leaders in most sectors of our economy have college degrees, and a disproportionately high number of them are white. White Americans comprise 94% of governors, 87% of the U.S. Senate, 76% of the U.S. House of Representatives, 80% of K-12 teachers, 73% of college faculty members, and 83% of college and university presidents. Given these demographics, post-secondary institutions act irresponsibly when we fail to create conditions that bring together whites and students of color to talk and learn across racial and political lines. This, as I see it, is a matter of institutional responsibility. According to the U.S. Department of Education, our country has 4,724 degree-granting post-secondary institutions. Shouting down and rescinding invitations from highly compensated guest speakers is an issue plaguing only a tiny fraction of that 4,724 colleges and universities. College student activists are often accused of attempting to suppress their professor's speech. In 2016, there were more than 1.4 million faculty members at U.S. colleges and universities. Even if 10,000 professors, which is a hypothetically high number, experienced aggressive encounters with speech suppressors on campus, that would be just 0.7% of the total faculty members nationwide. Most colleges and universities, including my own, host dozens, sometimes hundreds of speakers each year who bring a wide range of perspectives to campus. The overwhelming majority of these speakers do not experience protest. But unlike the few who do, many of whom, by the way, are entertainers, not academicians, unlike those, I would invite student protesters into a conversation with me about our ideological and factual disagreements. I would insist that those who support my viewpoints make space to respectfully listen to and talk with others who do not. It is not in entertainers' financial or celebrity interest to patiently engage disagreeable students in productive conversations across partisan and racial lines. Again, I believe that this is a challenge for college and university leaders. It is certainly not a matter for the Congress and the courts, in my opinion. I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Harper, are you suggesting entertainers don't have First Amendment rights?
I am absolutely respecting that entertainers have First Amendment rights. What I am suggesting, though, is that they're not there to advance educational purposes. These are educational institutions.
Yeah, they were invited by a university to come, and they have First Amendment rights, but they're not there to advance education. I don't get that. But we'll get to questions. I just want to be clear that entertainers, just because you're an entertainer doesn't mean you forfeit your First Amendment liberties on a college campus. Is that right?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Everyone.
Dr. George, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you. I wish to thank the chairman, the ranking member, Mr. Raskin, Mr. Palmer, and members of this committee for holding this important hearing and inviting me to give testimony. It's a particular honor to appear alongside Professor Stanger and Professor Weinstein, whose courage, integrity, and commitment to freedom of thought and expression and robust civil discourse are inspiring. I provided the committee staff with my formal written testimony. This afternoon, I wish to share some thoughts drawn largely from a statement I issued some months back with my dear friend and teaching partner, Professor Cornel West. Professor West and I, though representing different political perspectives, share concerns about the state of American higher education and the condition of American democracy. We worry that too narrow a range of perspectives is represented in a great many colleges and universities, especially among faculty, and that this tends to create an echo chamber in which education degenerates into indoctrination. Dissent is stigmatized, marginalized, and sometimes even punished or driven off the campus. We also worry that the American people are becoming polarized in ways that foment a level of distrust and hostility to each other, and an unwillingness to listen to and engage each other that undermines the foundations of our democratic civic life. And Mr. Raskin is correct that at the highest levels this is being exacerbated. It's also, alas, bipartisan. By hard experience, mankind has learned that the pursuit of knowledge and the maintenance of a free and democratic society require the cultivation and practice of certain virtues, including intellectual humility, openness of mind, and above all, love of truth. These virtues will manifest themselves and be strengthened by one's willingness to listen attentively and respectfully to intelligent people who challenge one's beliefs and who represent causes one disagrees with and points of view one does not share. That's why all of us should seek respectfully to engage with people who challenge our views, and we should oppose efforts to silence those with whom we disagree, especially on college and university campuses. As the great 19th century English liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill taught, a recognition of the possibility that we may be in error is a good reason to listen and honestly consider and not merely tolerate grudgingly to other points of view that we do not share and even perspectives that we find shocking and even scandalous. What's more, as Mill noted, even if one happens to be right about this or that disputed matter, seriously and respectfully engaging people who disagree will deepen one's understanding of the truth and sharpen one's ability to defend it. Now, none of us is infallible. That should be the starting point of any discussion of intellectual life. None of us is infallible. Whether you're a person of the right, the left, the center, or wherever, there are reasonable people of goodwill who do not share your fundamental convictions, and yet too often we refuse to acknowledge that. Now, this doesn't mean that all opinions are equally valid or that all speakers are equally worth listening to. It certainly does not mean that there's no truth to be discovered, nor does it mean that you are necessarily wrong. But they are not necessarily wrong either. So someone who has not fallen into the idolatry of worshiping his or her own opinions and loving them above truth itself will want to listen to people who see things differently in order to learn what considerations, evidence, reasons, arguments led them to a place different from where one happens, at least for now, to find oneself. All of us should be willing, even eager, to engage with anyone who is willing to do business in the currency of truth-seeking discourse by offering reasons, marshaling evidence, and making arguments. The more important the subject under discussion, the more willing we should be to listen to and engage, especially if the person with whom we are in conversation will challenge our deeply held, even our most cherished and identity-forming beliefs. It's all too common these days for people to try to immunize from criticism opinions that happen to be dominant in their particular communities, wherever they are. Sometimes this is done by questioning the motives and thus stigmatizing dissent from prevailing opinions, or by disrupting their presentations, or by demanding that they be excluded from campus, or if they've been invited, disinvited. Sometimes students and faculty members turn their backs on speakers whose opinions they don't like, or simply walk out or refuse to listen to those whose convictions offend their values. Of course, the right to peacefully protest, including on campuses, is sacrosanct, absolutely. But before exercising that right, I encourage my students to ask themselves, might it not be better to listen respectfully and try to learn from a speaker with whom one disagrees? Might it better serve the cause of truth-seeking to engage in a frank, civil discussion? Our willingness to listen to and respectfully engage those with whom we disagree contributes vitally to the maintenance of a milieu in which people feel free to speak their minds, consider unpopular opinions, explore the lines of argument that may undercut established ways of thinking. Such an ethos protects us against dogmatism and groupthink, both of which are toxic to the health of academic communities and to the functioning of democracies. When universities are permitted to degenerate into ideological echo chambers, which is what tends to happen when we lack viewpoint diversity, especially among faculty, freedom of thought and expression quickly come under attack and are sooner or later lost. Dissent from campus orthodoxy comes to be perceived and even experienced as attacks on our community's values and even personal assaults. People begin defining what they call hate speech way too broadly and saying such things as free speech is violence. Some may even begin defending actual violence, violence against dissenters from campus orthodoxies, as a form of free speech.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I want to thank all our witnesses for outstanding testimony and for the experiences you had and what you bring to the committees today.